Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. This video is a follow-up to the ones I did before on Jordan Peterson, because there was a point I made there, which I think was clear, but not clear enough given the cultural context in which we live, which, we could be anyone because it's a big world, but, being a modern American, I'm talking roughly in that sort of modern American context for those who share it to varying degrees, which is a Christian and largely, unfortunately, post-Christian, but Christian context. And Christianity has somewhat unusually throughout the world and world history a focus on historicity, which is not shared nearly so generally as people who grow up in this context think. And so the first question we tend to ask about everything is, is this historically accurate? Is this literally true? Notwithstanding the misuse of the word literally that some fundamentalists like to use. And you can see this actually going very, very far back in Christianity. I'm going to read just a brief part, just 2 paragraphs basically, of the second letter of St. Peter. He said, "That is why I will go on recalling the same truths to you, even though you already know them and are firmly fixed in these truths. I am sure it is my duty, as long as I am in this tent, to keep stirring you up with reminders, since I know the time for me to lay aside this tent is coming soon, as our Lord Jesus Christ made clear to me. And I shall take great care that after my own departure, you will still have a means to recall these things to mind." He's referring to his death, which Christ told, by the way. "When we told you about the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, we were not slavishly repeating cleverly invented myths. No, we had seen his majesty with our own eyes. He was honored and glorified by God the Father, when a voice came to him from the transcendent glory, 'This is my Son, the beloved, he enjoys my favor.' We ourselves heard this voice from heaven, when we were with him on the holy mountain." So you can see both that St. Peter was really intent on conveying this actually happened. Really, literally. What we said, reality, same thing. And he's trying to get this across also in a context in which those two things not being the same thing would be seen as relatively natural. Now, you can see this all over the place. If you actually study cultures other than modern culture, the literal truth of mythology is largely just assumed to be irrelevant. So, for example, if you see a Chinese sage telling somebody a story of there was a man who did the following, a man who went off and walked along, and on the path he saw he saw a gorilla fighting a crane, and so on. And then the moral of telling it, and then the moral of the story is something useful by which one can learn to live one's own life better. Nobody would care whether or not this actually happened. Was there really a man? What was his name? Who cares? What does it matter? He's long dead now. You can't go and meet him. There's nothing you can do with him. Whether or not there really was this man on a road, it doesn't matter. The only thing about that story is whether or not you can learn from what the man did in the story. I mean, you see this in Aesop's fables. Now, most of them are, told of animals and so on. So, the very fact that they're told of animals, a crow and a fox talking to each other and so on, makes you very strongly suspect that they did not, in fact, literally happen, because, amongst other things, if you saw a talking crow and a talking fox, you might remark on this more than just the wisdom provided in the moment. But, nonetheless, if you saw 2 people tricking each other this way, or, again, the story of the boy who cried wolf is actually a really great example, because it doesn't involve talking animals. Was there a boy who actually cried wolf in this manner? Who cares? Who on earth actually cares? What does it matter? You're not going to meet him. You're not going to talk to him. You're not going to interact with him in any fashion. Whether he really existed or didn't really exist doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. There's just something utterly bizarre about asking the question, well, did he really exist? And the thing is, it's not so bizarre in a Christian context, precisely because whether or not Jesus actually was nailed to a cross and died and came back from the dead matters. Because if he did, you're going to meet Jesus. You actually can interact with him. If the Eucharist, the body, the bread and wine turning into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. If that is merely a symbol, then whatever. If this is actually true, if you are actually eating God, and bear in mind what you do with your food is you make it a part of yourself, incorporating God into your very being, that actually matters in a real sense. There is a symbolic value, but on the other hand, if it's real, there's a value much greater than its symbolic value going on. So again, Christianity has that odd quirk to it, that its historical truth is more significant than its metaphorical truth, than its symbolic truth. So now I titled this video Jordan Peterson versus Jung. Now, I want to make a note about this, to be clear here. I don't mean the actual Jung. Carl Jung, I never read anything that Jung wrote. I am in no position to talk about Jung. I'm not trying to talk about Jung in the real sense. What I mean is Jung in the popular sense, because pretty much nobody reads Jung. However, he's certainly got a cultural influence, both directly through Joseph Campbell and so on, and that pop culture influence of Jung. So whenever I talk about Jung, I'm going to be talking about pop culture Jung. That is to say, that kind of idea that people have, almost all of whom have never read anything that Jung wrote. I'm not talking about the real one, so separate out those two, please. I'm only talking about the pop version. Now, in the pop version of Jung, what Jung suggested was, well, these stories are all false. Religious stories are all false, but they are psychologically very powerful. And because they are psychologically powerful, they are useful. And so it really doesn't matter that they're, not true, because they are useful. They are extremely useful, and they are more useful than any of the other tools we have at our disposal, because we don't have true narratives that have this power. So between a true narrative like I was hungry so I ate pizza, and a powerful narrative like something that you find in one of the world's religions, it makes much more sense to use the powerful one, even though it's not true, as opposed to true narratives that simply are worthless, have no power. So again, not the real Jung, the pop Jung goes something like that. And it makes sense in a context in which everybody is deeply concerned about historicity, which is to say basically a Christian context. You really care about the historicity of that there. Now, as opposed to, say, with the Buddha, when he was enlightened. Well, did Maya, the Lord of Illusions, actually show up like in a human form and tempt him? Well, presumably he was tempted by the, world as it was. Even someone who doesn't believe in his enlightenment at all believes that, after having concluded what he did, looking out at the world was a temptation to him, given what his conclusions were. When he touched the ground, because he just didn't care so much, did the ground really shake? Who cares? I tend to doubt it, but, it's possible that nobody ever believed the ground really genuinely shook, but rather, in this case, this means a strong rejection. And I fully believe that after that, that temptation, he did strongly reject it before he started telling others. So again, who cares about the historicity of this? And I doubt there are any Buddhists anywhere who ever cared about the historicity of it. Now, under those conditions, it is generally easiest to simply believe the historicity of it, because the historicity doesn't matter. Because if you're wrong about that historicity, and whatever. And it's just psychologically speaking, it works a little bit better. So, by and large, I think if you ask people, like, did it happen? They'll tell you, yeah, it happened. If it turned out that it didn't, would they be shocked? Not really. A Christian would be profoundly shocked if it turned out it didn't happen. It matters more than anything else whether or not it really did happen. Now, if you contrast that with, I think, what Jordan Peterson is doing, this will help to show what I think it is that Jordan Peterson is actually doing. Because Jordan Peterson does not, when he was asked, famously, there's an interview a lot of people have been talking about, where he started off by saying that perhaps the most straightforward answer is that, he was asked, are you a Christian? He said, perhaps the most straightforward answer to that is yes. Or probably, I think it was, the most straightforward answer to that is yes. And then he was asked, did you actually believe there's, a man who's who's a Jewish carpenter at that time, whose body was actually nailed to a cross, who died, and then whose body actually came back, from the dead. And he said, I'm agnostic on that. After a bunch of thought, which is also kind of interesting. But And here's the thing. Some people take that to mean not that he's agnostic, but that he doesn't believe it. Whereas I think the most straightforward interpretation of this is that he is agnostic. He does not know. He is unsure of this. And I think within this, you can contrast the approach I believe Jordan Peterson is taking to the Western approach that is in this Christian context. In that, to a Christian, the most important thing is that historical verity, the literal truth of it. Jordan Peterson's account is not, however, I believe, taking the pop Jungian approach of, sure, it's false, but stop worrying about that because there are more important things to worry about. I think what Jordan Peterson is doing, by contrast, is saying, stop asking the historical question. It's hard. It is very hard to figure out what happened 2,000 years ago with certainty. You can assume all sorts of answers, but to really get a very good, solid conclusion about this event that happened 2,000 years ago is hard. It takes a lot of study. And, obviously I'm putting words into his mouth, and I'm not trying to, literally put words into his mouth as my interpretation. But, take a look at things like the Case for Christ, where somebody went out, Lee Strobel, I believe his name was, went out and tried to really seriously look into the resurrection. And the result was an entire book. You can make a movie about what it was like, him spending weeks and weeks and weeks looking into this. This is a guy with a lot of resources who was able to use his connections to talk to all sorts of experts. It's really hard. Asking those historical questions is very, very hard. It's not easy to do. Moreover, if you're not particularly smart and having a long background, it's going to take you far, far longer because you're going to have to do even more study and spend even more time. And the thing is, instead of doing that incredibly hard thing that you're not very good at, if your life is broken, and if your life isn't broken, why the hell are you talking to him? Why are you talking to a psychologist if you're happy and everything's fine? You wouldn't be talking to a psychologist if you are happy and everything's fine. If you are not happy and everything is not fine, this means that historical investigation is now 100 times harder because you are a massively broken person attempting to do this incredibly hard thing. And the problem with being a massively broken person is that your thumbs are really on the scales, and you've got to then spend the effort of figuring out how are your thumbs on the scales so you can take them off. Instead of doing this incredibly hard work that you're going to have a tremendously difficult time ever coming up with a decent answer on, that's really a truthful answer you can believe, stop right now. Stop doing that. Don't assume yes. Don't assume no. Just stop. Stop doing it. No. Stop. No. Stop. And, if you watch his videos, the repetition is kind of a symbol of the fact you need to tell someone this over and over and over again, because as a Western person, it's ingrained in us to just ask that question. But just stop that. You're injured. You're sick. You're in the position of somebody with a bleeding gut wound because you are unhappy. You're a person talking to a psychologist who wants to figure out a way to be happy. So instead of worrying about the thing that's really hard to do, that you're trying to do with like a bleeding gut wound, start tending to the bleeding gut wound first. Leave the other stuff on hold. Don't answer yes, don't answer no. Don't assume an answer to that at all. Deal with your other problem first, because that is not nearly so bad a problem to solve. And this is where we come into that distinction, whereas Jung said, assume, despite the fact that there's an answer here, just pretend that that's not the answer. And Jordan Peterson, I believe, is taking the vastly more honest approach of saying, you don't know the answer, don't pretend that you know the answer, and don't put this stuff on hold that is extremely important that you actually can attend to in order to solve this incredibly hard problem that you're not really very competent at solving anyway first. Once you've taken care of this stuff, then you can worry about that thing. The historicity you can worry about afterwards, once you are actually mended enough to be in a decent position to worry about the historicity. It's a very, very foreign, very alien approach. In the podcast I had linked to in the previous video, it was interesting because he used the one as the sort of Enlightenment thinking, which he used Richard Dawkins to symbolize. And on the other hand, he had used Darwin to symbolize the Darwinian thought, which is the practical, pragmatic approach of what actually works. And he contrasted this with two methods of evaluating truth, because there's the one which is the historicity sort of question, which is one way of evaluating truth. What can we measure? What can we, determine in that fashion? And then there is the what actually works for you as a human being, what will keep you from going insane and doing things like committing suicide, because plenty of unhappy people do. So those are two approaches, and the pop Jung version is to say, even though you know the answer here, pretend that you don't, or just ignore the answer and go focus on this. Whereas I think Jordan Peterson is in a vastly more honest position of saying, you don't know the answer here. Stop pretending that you do. And moreover, stop pretending that you're going to figure it out if you just spend a few minutes at it. Because if you're going to do that, you'd have already figured out that answer. You're not going to figure this out in just a few minutes, because you haven't already. So stop focusing on the thing you can't do and focus on something else instead, without just assuming what you're doing over here. And that, I think, it's properly understood as a shift out of the Western paradigm. It's a shift out of that historical context, which makes sense, that the worst position to be in is a Christian mentality, is to think like a Christian but believe that Jesus is still in his grave. That is the worst of all possible worlds, in a sense, because your entire mind is built around something that you hold to be false, and so nothing in that perspective is workable. It just doesn't make any sense. The world contradicts itself. It's a failure. And so, ideally, the easiest way for you out of this is to discover the fact that Christ actually is not in his grave and rose from the dead, and that it's all true, and then the world all makes sense. Everything integrates properly, and your Christian mentality works well with the historical truth of the resurrection, and everything meshes, and you have one of the only non-contradictory, asterisk, because, Judaism being uncompleted, it's still true. So, it's consistent as well. But you have just about the only consistent worldview that exists, and everything's great. But if you can't do that, if you can't discover the historical truth of Christianity, you're screwed if you're still in that Christian mentality. And so I believe the best way to understand what Jordan Peterson is telling people to do is to get out of that Christian mentality if you're not a Christian. If you're not a Christian, get out of the Christian mentality. And this actually dovetails extremely well with, C.S. Lewis observed that the modern world is not in the position, in considering Christianity, it's not like in the position of being a virgin, it's like in the position of being a divorcee. Very, very, very different mindset. Or again, there's a great line from Chesterton that said that if the modern world ends in being pagan, it will end as the pagan world did. I do not mean it will end in chaos. I mean that it will end in Christianity. I think it was Mark Shea who paraphrased Chesterton as saying, the last thing that we know about the real pagans is that they sought baptism. So a pagan can consider Christianity. A pagan can look at Christianity from the outside and really seriously consider it. A Christian somebody who has a Christian mindset but not Christian belief can't really consider much of anything at all. They can't even give paganism a fair hearing. And so that, I think, is at least what seems to me to be what Jordan Peterson is doing, is saying that if you have a Christian mindset but not Christian belief, and can't start believing, you can't have Christian belief, then stop having a Christian mindset. Because the two just, a Christian mindset without Christian belief does not work at all. In the way that like a pagan mindset but a Buddhist belief is fairly compatible, as can be seen by how often Buddhism syncretizes with pagan and other religions. So there's almost a unique problem in a Christian mindset without Christian belief, which is loosely what you can call post-Enlightenment thinking, which Jordan Peterson symbolized by Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins, in fact, does sort of almost uniquely work badly, intellectually speaking. Read anything he writes, and it's just a disaster. It's a complete disaster. The man knows nothing about human beings. Astonishingly, almost laughably so. Occasionally infuriatingly so as well. But be that part as it may, that is what I propose, and what I tried to propose in my previous videos, is the proper understanding of what Jordan Peterson is doing. So, hope that helps, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.